Good afternoon and welcome to Cold Chain Connect, the podcast that focuses everything temperature control logistics for the pharmaceutical industry. My name is Thomas Hunt, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Chandan Trehan, who is an expert and thought leader around business transformation, digital transformation, CRM, supply chain and circular economics with Bosch Global Technology Services. Chandan spent over a decade experience leading large-scale transformation initiatives across industries. He specializes in digital supply chains, CRM strategy, circular economy, and emerging technologies like AI, blockchain, IoT. You may have seen him previously at some of the industry events specializing around cold chain logistics specifically, where he's very much seen as a thought leader. And he's also recognized as a top 50 global thought leader by Thinkers 360. Chandan, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Tom, and super excited to be on the podcast today.
Good. So just before we kick off, why don't you give our listeners who haven't sort of heard of you before just a bit about your current role there at Bosch and what it is you're doing?
Yeah, I lead the digital transformation in the supply chain space here at Bosch. One of my key roles is to speak to different entities within Bosch and some of our partner entities to identify what are those areas where digital intervention can be brought in to make our systems more optimized, more sustainable, and more resilient, given that we operate in an environment which has all kinds of risks across. So one of my key jobs is to make sure that we work together and create supply chains of the future.
Very good. And in terms of Bosch, it's not a brand that's necessarily known for this and the global services division. What is it that they specialize in and how big is it?
So Bosch is a $100 billion company, and we've been there for around 142 plus years. We have largely got four divisions. Automotive happens to be one of the biggest sector for us. Around 60% of our revenues come from automotive. Other than that, we've got consumer electronics and technologies. We've got sensor tech and healthcare services that we largely operate in.
Okay. You specialize in tech across many industries, and you've got a broad knowledge across many. With AI and how it's sort of changed things over for certainly the last couple of years for many industries, how have you seen it reshaping cold chain operations as of today? Where are we on that journey?
I think one of the big change that has happened with the AI coming in is people have moved from what used to be a traditional monitoring exercise to a more proactive decision-making exercise. We are talking about quality processes, quality systems with a flavor of continuous quality monitoring and not just quality monitoring at certain points or at certain event areas when the supply chain, as the things and products move across in the supply chain. So that's one of the big differentiation that AI brings into place. Of course, it is in tandem with other technologies like IoT and blockchain in some cases. But I think that's one of the big differentiation. We are now able to unearth some of the patterns which were not very easily available or not very easily visible to us. We are now able to do our work much faster. I think everybody who has been in the cold chain industry knows the pain of writing a deviation report when the product does not meet its standards in terms of the temperature and the humidity in which the product was supposed to be maintained. And some of that can be automated to a very large extent when you have technologies like generative AI coming in. It reduces a lot of strain on human in general, takes a little bit of a cognitive load and helps us do our work much faster, much better.
Okay. Many of our listeners aren't obviously experts in digital in this area. Can you explain to us what Gen AI is and agent-based intelligence for pharma logistics, and really just a breakdown of how it can be used and utilized in your experience?
So I'll maybe start by giving an example of what AI versus Gen AI versus what agentic AI is supposed to do. So Gen AI allowed us a lot of predictive, prescriptive capabilities. It told us it could identify pattern to a very large extent. It was rule-based. Of course, the rule could change. There were mechanisms like machine learning, which is going to constantly evolve the rule over a period of time. But it was very largely rule-based. That's what traditional AI used to do. When Gen AI came in, it is a technology that takes away a lot of cognitive loads from humans. It has the capability to reason out things. It has the capability to identify, given that a certain situation has happened, and I have got four options to choose from. Which one of these makes the most logical sense for me to choose? So in certain ways, this used to be a logical decision that people or humans used to make at some point. Now that kind of cognitive load is going to be reduced significantly with the Gen AI coming in. Of course, I'm not saying it's going to replace humans. It's going to always keep human in loop, at least given the way the technology is progressing even now. but
Mhm.
a lot of that cognitive load gets reduces. When agentic AI comes in, it also brings in a level of automation onto this, where it says that there is a goal that has been assigned to an AI bot, and that goal becomes the only thing that the bot cares about for the rest of its life, as long as it exists. So it's going to use all kind of cognitive learning that it has developed over a period of time, logical reasoning that it has developed over identify parameters which do not necessarily fit into the system from a very generic standpoint, and then
Mhm.
identify what is the best way to achieve that goal that has been assigned for it. So if you look at it from a system that identified pattern to a system that identified logic of how we can do things, to adding a goal onto that logic to achieve that outcome as well. So that is where the agentic AI comes in.
Okay.
I'm very, yeah, go ahead.
And is it so specifically? I mean, I've seen it being sort of applied to things like forecasting, planning, risk assessment, mapping. Are there key areas are there certain areas where it's really useful, and some where it's being used more on the outskirts, or what's the adoption curve that you've seen in pharma currently in supply chain for logistics specifically?
I think, Thomas, great question. See, how do we see this? Is it only because we have a new technology does not necessarily mean that there are new problems to solve? The problem of forecast accuracy, the problem of deviations happening in the supply chain and the cold chain were always there. The technology, what it does is it can actually help you unearth patterns which were not very easily identifiable in the past. So with traditional AI, those patterns were the ones that we used to feed into the system, that look, if the system has been out of the temperature range for a certain number of times, you are going to call that shipment as not good enough to be put on the shelves, or not enough to be administered, a vaccine not enough good enough to be administered to a patient. Gen AI coming in now, you can unearth patterns beyond temperature. You can run scenarios, you can run risk management. That's a very wonderful example. Imagine there used to be a time when we used to create risk databases. Like we used to create risk mitigation plans. More often than not, they were SOPs that were designed for certain type of risk assessment. As
Mm.
humans, we can probably do that for certain number of risks. Mostly, that is going to be based on the experience that we've had with that risk being materialized, being seen in the past. With Gen AI coming in, risk management is taken to another level altogether. It can identify potential risks, even if they have not been materialized in the past 10, 20, 30 years, ever since you started collecting data about your supply chain. So, and of course, there is a certain level of human autonomy, or a certain level of human in loop that needs to be brought in. A Gen AI could hallucinate and say that there is a dinosaur attack that happens on your and that happens on your supply chain. Sometimes it's the human in loop that has to come in and say that, well, that's a risk that which has probably got a 0% possibility of ever being materialized. While the systems themselves have the capability to unearth new risk systems, help you create that SOP for your risk. That's a wonderful use case, but like I keep saying, it's always a mix of human and these kind of technologies working together that's going to create most difference.
Yeah. And is there a platform that, say you want to build out an agent-based model in this space? How do you do that? What's the platform that you should use? Because obviously there's so much out there.
There are a lot of platforms that are available. Some of these platforms are relatively much easier to use. One of the days when you would really need a very technically proficient person to create these agents. These days with agent development frameworks and similar things that have come in, it's become a lot more easier for people to develop agents by themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Yeah. It's just it's one of those areas when you look at agents, it's whether you're using sort of a model like a ChatGPT or Copilot, or you're going to use an IBM, or if you're looking at CRM, you've got sort of Salesforce, etc. And it's almost it's a whole other division in itself, isn't it, in terms of building out an agent based approach? But and it's a complex area that people are struggling.
It's yeah. I mean, see, there are different ways you would probably want to look at it. Yes, there are just Chat GPTs, and there are other models that exist. Some of them are, and in fact, as you would have seen, sometimes it's not just the large language models that you necessarily need to use. Even small language models, in certain cases, can do the job very well. Some of the models that we are experimenting with are actually on-prem hosted model and not cloud hosted model or publicly hosted models in the Bosch world, which allow us to make sure that there is right kind of cybersecurity aspects that have also been taken into consideration. There is certain amount of sensitivity that is associated with the data that we feed out to the system. So we want to
Mhm.
make sure that those kind of guardrails and safety process and security procedures are also taken into consideration. So
Mm.
ChatGPT, of course, one of the most common models. Copilot is also built on that. But what I'm seeing a lot of companies operate on or experiment with is also with small language models, oftentimes the ones that can be hosted on in an on-prem environment, not touched by the public infrastructure.
Okay, interesting. And when you look at, I know you've done work on digital twins, and it's an area that you certainly got some expertise in. How do digital twins help protect and prevent cold chain disruption? In your experience, what's the end to end? I mean, it's quite obvious for people who are in that space, but just break us down a digital twin and how you've seen it used in our world.
So one big differentiation that a technology like digital twin brings in is now you can run simulations on your systems for different types of ways in which your supply chain could fail. So in a way, you are adding more resilience to your overall supply chain processes. You are getting to a situation which is a lot more prepared than what you would have been otherwise. So different types of scenario modeling, like, what if the weather changes dramatically over the next few weeks that supply chain, that the shipment has to move? What is going to be the impact? What is the right temperature I need to maintain? Flip side for that is it also allows you to optimize the supply chain processes to a certain extent. If it is already too cold, you probably do not need the cooling in your reefer to be on for the entire duration. How do you optimize based on the weather data? How do you optimize based on any kind of disruptions that could possibly happen? We have seen situations like a Baltimore bridge collapse, or a situation where there is a certain amount of labor shortage that is happening. So how do you plan your energy usage in your cold chain, especially in the reefer units, to optimize for those kind of scenarios, those kind of disruptions as and when they happen in the supply chain? So one of the biggest differentiator that the digital twin for a supply chain brings in is it can help you run simulations. It can help you identify those kind of risks even before they happen.
Okay. And is this been adopted quite widely in pharma in your experience, or are we still quite behind the curve in terms of digital twins?
I would not say that it has been absorbed as, it has been taken up as widely as I would have hoped it would. There are reasons for that. One, even though first supply chain as an industry, we haven't been very good at collecting a lot of data over a period of time. It's only recently that we started realizing the value of data itself. So there's not enough data sometimes for the systems to really develop that kind of intelligence. Secondly, sometimes even if the data exists, chances are the data is very, very siloed. You would have LIMS systems that have some amount of data. You'll have, your MES systems that will have some amount of data for your manufacturing systems, your SAP systems. There could be a logistics management system that you could be running, a transport management system that you could be running. Data does, even in cases where data exists, it is often very siloed. That's these two have largely been the reasons. There are also a certain amount of cultural aspects to this. As logistics as an industry, we have been very good at firefighting. From moving from a situation like that to believing in something which is run out on probabilities, believing in something which is a little bit more probabilistic than the real world situation. It requires a little bit of a cultural change as well. Oftentimes, you're going to see the data itself being challenged. And okay, it predicts that this is where the things are going to go wrong, but we have never seen something like this happen in the past. How do I believe that this is the area where I need to make investments to protect our supply chain from going through that kind of excursion? And so it requires a little bit of cultural change as well. But largely, it's the availability of data and the way the data is being stored and managed that makes it a little difficult for all organizations to leverage a technology like digital twin in supply chains.
And with digital twins, are they leveraging their own internal systems and data and putting that themselves, or are they outsourcing to a partner like Smart CAE who can do simulations and modeling, etc., on various lanes? What's the approach? How do you set this up?
In my experience, I'm seeing a mix of both these options. Some amount of data is impossible for all organizations to develop. There are very good risk management database systems, the databases that are available in the industry. Most organizations would not want to build a risk management data by themselves. It requires you to scrape a lot of internet data and things of that nature. It's not always easy to bring that kind of data. So oftentimes you are going to leverage these kind of databases that are available for some fee. When it comes to scenario modeling, oftentimes people start internally, but then there are organizations that can do this much faster. Some of these scenarios, they take time to build. So if there is an organization that is there and they have already built some of these scenarios and saves you certain amount of lead time in building those scenarios, it's always a good idea to take from them. It's always that make versus buy kind of decision when it comes to it. I'm seeing a mix of both. For very large organization, I'm seeing more of make than buy. But
Right.
yeah, it's honestly a mix of both.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think one of the challenges we were speaking to a customer the other day, and it's around the ability to draw global weather data is obviously challenging. But when you have a global picture across millions of lanes, that's where you can get a true sort of, you can really get a good idea of where the risks
Yeah,
is.
exactly. See, lane information, not something that every organization can develop by themselves.
No.
Weather data, one example that you gave. There could be other risk management data like financial risk of your suppliers. You don't want to go about tracking financial risk of those suppliers. You don't want to track geopolitical risk associated with those supplier locations where they're operating for. Some of this data, and the good part is you don't have to. While this
Mm.
may be a critical data point for you to consider in your risk management system in building those scenarios and simulations in your control towers and digital twins, you don't have to necessarily build all this data by yourself. There are organizations that sell this data to you for a certain amount of money, and you can just use that to build those scenarios.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then the one area we've seen was a slight weak spot is a very good understanding about temperature deviations, etc., in warehousing and trucking on the tarmac. In a reefer container, from the modeling of a reefer during an unplug period, so when it's going into port and the reefer's unplugged and there's a power outage, what happens inside that reefer, there seems to be quite limited understanding. Though there's also a gap in certain, because obviously a lot of the industry is trying to move into ocean as well, away from air, or where they can to drive down costs. But the understanding of what happens in a reef during an unplug is there's definitely a knowledge gap there, I think. And how you feel that, I suppose, is just with trials and more and more data going into the system.
No, that is true. I think despite all the great technology that we have in place, there are places where traceability does break. We usually use a metric here, which is traceability index for any particular product. And it is not just about real-time monitoring of this. We also go to the historical data to understand in which cases have these traceability index has this traceability index been relatively low. It gives us, and the idea is to develop some certain type of pattern that we can draw from that data to understand that certain lanes have got these problems more frequently. Certain certain partners that we are working with sometimes have this kind of problem more frequently. So when we develop those kind of insights, it is not about taking a punitive action. It is also sometimes about having that you know that we've seen this is an area where some of our partners are falling behind, and we see that other partners are doing much better. Why don't you walk us through about what your processes are? Let us work together to solve this and make the system more succinct as we speak. So yeah, we use all that data. Traceability index is critical. Yeah, sometimes, and most of these cases is off plug period, because that's a point when the sensor data is often not available to us. We are also
Mhm.
experimenting with sensors that do have data storage capabilities, so that as and when they get online, they can now start transmitting data even for the times when they were unplugged or not connected to the internet or the
Okay.
Wi-Fi band.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Good. And you touched briefly there on IoT, and obviously we've seen a big explosion on devices and this space in the last few years. Beyond just monitoring, how can IoT deliver predictive insights in your experience?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting ways I've seen people use IoT data is to identify packaging material that they were using. Certain type of packaging material provided them better storage conditions for the products that were moving. And that kind of insight was unearthed again, going back to the historical data, identifying how and when you're doing, trying to build up those patterns. And I know you use this word pattern a lot because there's so much that we can learn from history, and we need to just go back, pick up the old data points, define what went wrong. It is about learning from the mistakes that have happened in the past. So even when it is not about just monitoring and providing information about the quality of the product as and when it is moving, it is also about the other finer aspects of the product itself, like how packaging is having an impact. What are some lanes that are operating better versus those that are not operating that great? So those kind of use cases, I've seen organizations of all sizes invest heavily on those kind of use cases as well.
In terms of IoT and changing traceability, do you think we're at our limit now in terms of where that technology has got to, or where is the gap with an IoT and devices? What's the next phase of that tech in terms of where it might go?
So I think, Thomas, sometimes it is not just about the technology alone. I think
Hmm.
it's very common for us to think that transformation is largely around technology itself. It is a combination of people, process, and technology. And that kind of reminds me a very interesting anecdote from something that we experienced when we were working with one of our customers. We built a digital twin for them for their supply chain, and they used to be it was a system that is going to give you an alert almost immediately as and when an excursion happens, and everything was tested, working very great, and we were actually so proud of it. We kind of published papers and spoke about it at certain forums and everything. But over a period of time, we realized that excursions continue to happen, and we thought there's no way this technology can fail. And we used to do so many smoke tests to see if it's the technology itself that is failing. And you would not believe what happened. It was the technology was state of art, no doubts about it. It was all working great. The email about that excursion was going to a shared folder.
Right.
Now, when that email went to a shared folder, the operations team, they thought it's a QA team's problem. QA team thought it's a logistics team's problem. Logistics team thought that, well, we have achieved the state of art system. It's going to take care of it by itself. And nobody actually acted on it. So it was actually such a simple thing when we talk about it today. But imagine that could be a point of failure when it comes to making those heavy investments, those great investments in the technology side, and only to realize that it is still not delivering those results. So sometimes it is not just about the technology, it is about the process and the people, or the cultural aspect of the change management aspect that has to go in hand in hand. So if you ask me honestly, Tom, technology, yes, there's a certain amount of technology evolvement that's going to happen. We're going to have better sensors. We're going to have sensors that can measure a large veracity of data and such. But my challenge at this point is the other neglected piece, which is the people and the process piece, that is going to be a challenge going forward. It is not going to be so much on the technology. I think we have a lot of technology. Any kind of evolution in that technology is always welcome, but we have enough technology today to do a lot of things. It is the people and the process piece that is sometimes pulling us back.
100%. Yeah, I think the change management is often underestimated with tech, bringing new technology in. In your experience, if companies are bringing new technology in, say IoT or devices or whatever it is, into their businesses or divisions, what is the process they should follow in general to have a smooth as transition as possible?
See, I think the first and foremost thing is to have a certain level of tech literacy in your organization. When we were transforming ourselves into an AIoT company, we had an AI literacy program where everybody, irrespective of their wake of job, was supposed to go through a certain level of AI training. It helps in two ways. One is, yes, people realize there's a lot of misinformation that is floating around, right? Around Gen AI. There's only a part of it is, or probably a lot of that is untrue. But when people learn about these technologies, they understand it. You tend to fear what you do not know. When they learn about the technology, the fear quotient of that reduces significantly. People understand that, okay, a lot of these things that are spoken about today is very dreamy. It is going to take significant amount of data, significant amount of time for us to really get there. Completely autonomous supply chains. People have been talking about it for 3 years. If you really do a deep dive into the technology, you're going to realize that it's still going to take some more time for you to develop a completely autonomous supply chain. That's one aspect of this.
Just on that point, just on that first point, sorry, where do you get that knowledge from? Because you're quite right, there's a lot of information about AI and it can be confusing. How do you get the right information into your team?
So it's a combination of what's happening in the industry. You have material that is available for you to read. You have to go to the trusted sources of those material. You also learn from industry peers, people who are actually rolling up the sleeves and getting their hands dirty with the technology itself. They are the ones who can give you the best understanding that even if quantum computing exists today, there are certain limited number of use cases that it can be used for. Those it's a combination of peer learning and learning from the right sources as well. And then the second aspect of this AI literacy or technology literacy program is when people learn about these things, they also find ways in which this technology can be introduced in their work, in their jobs. So you don't always necessarily need to have some consultants coming from outside and telling you that, this is how the job has to be transformed for so-and-so role. It can be people who are actually living that job who can come in and suggest that, I believe this is how technology can make my life easier. And I think there's a lot of merit in it, because when the ideas come from the people who are living that, the change management aspect of becomes relatively easy. It becomes a lot easy. So versus, somebody coming from outside and suggesting that this is how you should be doing your job. So it helps in both ways. It removes the fear from the minds of the people and also helps them understand that technology is there to help them, not to take things away from them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. In terms of risk management, what's the biggest risk that you see currently with supply chains, specifically obviously for pharmaceuticals, when it relates to technology and the digital side of things? Where are we weakest at the moment?
See, I think I spoke about this as well in the start, but the biggest risk that we have in the supply chain space are all the invisible risks that we live with. The data gaps that exist, the manual handoffs that happen in the supply chain, delayed responses that we may receive from people. Like the one perfect example that you gave, when the reefer is unplugged, it is very limited information that you will have about what's happening, what's the temperature, whether it has been maintained at the right temperature or not. When it comes back online is when you're going to get that information. So I think those are some of the big risks that we operate in. The processes in general, the digital processes have actually, the complexity itself has outpaced all kinds of manual controls that could be potent. The biologics, cell and gene therapies that are happening, there are multi-currency, multi-country clinical trials that happen. And this kind of complexity requires the right kind of technology infusion from the traceability and supply chain information perspective as well. So
Mhm.
in many cases, we do not have that. I think those are some of the big risks that we run in the supply chains today.
Okay. Governance and data. The other sort of question I had was how do we ensure data integrity and compliance in digital supply chain? And I think the data thing also comes back to the Gen AI and agent area where it's obviously in pharmaceuticals, we're all very protective over our information, our lane information, our data, etc., and how the technology is interwoven into our systems and interwoven into our businesses, but also protecting our data, I know is a major concern for a lot of people. So how do you see that?
So I think one very critical thing that we have to understand is data governance, data integrity has to be built in the design itself. It has to be a part of your architecture and it cannot be an afterthought. So talking about immutable audit trails, talking about role-based access control, those are the things, or automated validation rules. These things have to be baked into the architecture itself. And that's the only way you can have the right kind of integrity brought in. Clear data ownership assigned. And so compliance becomes aspect of product design
Mm-hmm.
and not an afterthought that is given to the product. So I think these are some critical ways in which you can ensure that there is right kind of data integrity. And yes, we believe some of these systems are struggling with that. There are also systems that are doing incredibly well when it comes to data integrity and data ownership establishment or role-based access control. We have also seen systems that have not been designed that way. I think some of these old systems that we are working with, I think data governance did not happen to be one of the biggest aspects of product design at that point of time. So we are living to live with some sort of legacy systems that
Mm.
struggle with those things. But most of the modern systems that we are looking at, they are designed very well for integrity.
Right. Okay. Because legacy systems, obviously, in certain areas like CRM, is incredibly difficult to move away from, and obviously in big organisations, it's a massive change management process. To do those legacy systems, how prepared, in your experience, are they for the new world that you're describing in terms of tech?
I think legacy systems, I would not deny that there is a lot of struggle when it comes to managing legacy systems, especially for these new age topics like, improved data governance, data integrity, and such. There are mechanisms people have developed around
Hmm.
these systems, which are good and bad. I think it's a mixed bag of opinion that people have around it. Yes, I think it's a no-brainer that everybody believes that legacy systems have to eventually be replaced by newer modern systems. They're
Mm.
designed for these times. So yeah, this struggle is real. Organizations that are stuck to those legacy systems are definitely having a lot of challenges when it comes to these topics.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You work in food, I think, and you've got a lot of experience in food. What can pharma learn from the food industry? Are there things that there's good crossover there that we're not doing?
I think one of the big learnings that we can have from the food industry is the speed, scale, and the cost efficiency in the food space, right? So we have to look at pharma as an industry which is trying to help patients, while food as an industry is trying to, in a certain way, solve the food safety problem or ensuring that the food is available for people to consume and such. Of course,
Mhm.
the volumes are different, but if you see the pharma supply chains are intrinsically way more expensive to manage versus a food supply chain. Food
Mhm.
supply chains are very frugal when it comes to it. So I think there's a lot of learnings that we can draw from the food supply chain, especially around effectiveness, efficiency, and those kind of things onto the pharma. But again, I wouldn't say it's very simple to pick up ideas from there and bring it here. This is a very regulated market, very different market from food is also regulated, but maybe not as regulated as pharma. The industries are different, but if there's one thing that I have to learn from the food industry, it's the efficiency and the cost at which they operate versus pharma.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we spoke to someone a few weeks ago who was talking about the specialist hubs in perishables can be really helpful because they get, this is an airport handling business, who an airline who was getting much greater visibility from the food industry in terms of what was coming down in terms of demand, so they could plan, and that gave them a much better sort of seamless supply chain through their hub, and obviously allowed them to drive down costs, where pharma can be quite reactive in terms of how they operate sometimes, certainly with air.
That is also true. If I compare the level of reactive uh, behavior that we see in the pharma side versus food side, yes, pharma is a lot more reactive. And I think those are some of the reasons why it is expensive as well. If you could
Yeah.
predict some of these things a little earlier, you will have mitigation mechanisms and mitigation strategies which would be defined in a way that help you optimize your cost and the time that is associated.
Yeah.
If you ask me, Thomas, honestly, I think when it comes to cold chain, the most important thing that you have to look at is the time. Sometimes it is not just about the cost also, because pharma is designed for a very different way. Vaccine has to reach the people. It doesn't matter if it is a tad bit more expensive or tad bit less expensive, but the product has to reach, because you're talking about saving lives. Food, on the other hand, has a little bit of luxury on that front, right? It's a very organizational impact that you're looking at. Yeah, it's difficult to look at it, but yes, I think it's the predictability that makes food a little bit more optimized in terms of cost and management.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And then, well, as we look into the future, the next 5 years, which emerging technologies do you think will define cold chain in the next 5 years? What's coming down the road, do you think, and where will we be?
I think AI is going to play a more prominent role in this, including Gen AI. I gave one example at the very beginning, those deviation reports that we used to write. We don't, necessarily need to have people who are pouring their, hours into writing a deviation report and the reasons and such. Once the logical reasoning evolves to a certain level of maturity, these kind of reports can be automated to a very large extent. So that's going to take away some of those. If you look at the entire value stream of cold chain monitoring for for somebody who's managing the cold chain inventory, there are activities which are value added and they have to necessarily do that. But then there are a lot of non-value adding yet essential activities, right, that they need to build. In many ways, these deviation reports are going to be the founding data on which the future deviation reports are going to be automatically prepared. Right? The system has to learn from somewhere. So it's the human intelligence that's going to be translated later. It's going to transcend into the automation that is brought in. So a lot of these critical non-value adding activity yet essential activities that you need to perform can be automated. I think there's a lot of efficiency gains that we can look at there. Agentic AI are also going to play a very prominent role. I often say this in my conversations. 5 years, 6 years down the line, a manager will not have just people reporting into him. It's going to be a combination of agents and people who will be working together to solve the critical KPIs that they optimize the critical KPIs that the manager is going to look at. So these technologies are out there, but I think it's going to take a little bit more time for us to adopt. But these are going to be very game-changing technologies in times.
Yeah, great, interesting. Okay, very good. We got a lot of sort of obviously large 3PLs and large pharma who are quite far along their adoption curve in terms of tech, and they're well set up to take advantage. And obviously, we have a lot of the smaller forwarders and smaller players in our space. For those guys who are starting their digital journey kind of today, or starting to look at this, what are the top 3 priorities that you would advise them to start with?
I think first and foremost, start by keeping the data in mind. You want to make sure that you have got the right systems that capture the data into the system. So any kind of transformation today is going to be data-driven digital transformation. It's not going to be just about the technology tools that you're bringing in. It's what kind of data is being captured, how do you plan to use that data, and what is going to be the future that you envision that this data is going to give you. Like I said, deviation reports that are being created today are going to act as the foundation for automation of deviation report preparation in future. So understand where you are. I would also suggest, do not be bogged down by, this is what the technology does today. Technology itself is also evolving. So feel free to set a little bit of aggressive goals when it comes to your transformation programs, but understand where the technology is today so that you can pace those goals accordingly and have that right kind of thing. And finally, it is not just about the technology alone. No amount of technology that you pour into the system is going to solve the problem for you unless you look at it from a more holistic people, process, and technology piece.
Well, thank you, Chandan, for coming on to the podcast. It's been a brilliant conversation, and you've got an incredible knowledge in the space. So hopefully I can catch up with you at Logic Pharma or one of the other events that you're attending in next year, because it would be good to carry on the conversation. Good. So you've been listening to Cold Chain Connect. My name's Thomas Hunt, and this is the podcast that focuses everything around cold chain and pharmaceuticals. Tune in next week for our next episode. Thank you.